Our next session is a panel discussion. We've invited two industry experts who will explore the diverse landscape of carbon credit purchases, ranging from corporate sustainability goals to regulatory compliance and brand enhancement. And it's been great because Allison kind of led the charge in giving us a bit of insight as to what the world looks like in that space. I'm going to have Marty introduce our panelists, and he will moderate this particular session. Marty.
All right, thanks, Pat. I'd certainly encourage questions as we go. I think we kind of found a rhythm here this morning, so if I have somebody with a microphone at least at the ready who could march it around, and always encourage you to introduce yourself, where you're from. I think it helps with the networking at an event like this. So speaking of introductions, I want to introduce these two other gentlemen up here on the panel with me. The first one's Joseph Grimaldi, and Joe and I have an interesting past because it's only about 8 weeks old, and he reached out to me on LinkedIn randomly. I find that in this space of carbon, it happens a ton, a random outreach on LinkedIn, and don't you know, we hit it off and had a conversation.
Immediately, yes.
And he's got a passion around this topic, and I'll maybe let you introduce yourself, kind of your background a little bit, and then I'll set up Nathan next. So go ahead, Joe.
Well, hello everybody. I'm Joseph Grimaldi. I'm from Hamilton. I'm the president of Superior Technical Solutions, and that's right. It was just a pleasure to meet Marty. I recently completed a sustainability leadership course at the University of Toronto Rotman School of Management. So my past experience is I worked for Honeywell for many years. I transitioned in the P3 space, public-private partnership, and I was instrumental in transitioning 5 of the major mental health institution hospitals in Ontario. And then also I was involved with the pharmaceutical industry. We were creating a 1 million square foot facility in Denmark for medical cannabis in Europe, for the European market. So that started my journey on sustainability. Being in Europe, as Allison mentioned, you know, they're the leaders when it comes to sustainability. They're more aggressive than we are in North America, I would say, and that got me on that path of thinking, you know, there's more to this. And then when I started, after finishing my course, I had a good conversation with myself, working with Neil on a couple things, really sparked my interest in entering this field. It's ironic because these companies that I worked with and for are going to be my clients now. So in the carbon space.
So Joseph's from Hamilton, flew in here today or yesterday to join us for this, and he's taken on an assignment to help us monetize and commercialize some of our carbon credits. So in full disclosure, he's an extension of our business line. He's really here today as his independent thinker in terms of he's been in this space for, I'll say, in a recent amount of time, not for 15 or 20 years, but you'll feel it in his passion on the topic and the opportunity here. My old friend, I'll call him my old friend Nathan, we were doing some math. We met back in 2012, and Nathan was a Regina guy at the time, and much like Joseph, the two gentlemen on the panel really bring diversity of thought. Nathan, Saskatoon guy, but we met in Regina and did a bunch of business together, but he's since moved on to build out a company called FrontRunner, and he's a Toronto-based guy today. And Nathan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
For sure, thanks Marty, and it's very fitting that the first media installation that we ever did, you were on site, you saw it take place in real time, about a block and a half away on Albert Street, and since have built a global media company that turns the windows of empty retail into dynamic and interactive content. So we actually positioned ourselves as a sustainable business right out of the gate because we're actually taking spaces that are literally running on empty and turning them into the epicenters of high streets around the world. So I'm just including this here just so you to help visualize what FrontRunner is up to and what we'll be speaking to today in a recent, agreement that we came to with Carbon RX. But we basically developed an asset class called Window Front, where our clients are real estate groups that have spaces and media companies that are just wanting to get into the out-of-home landscape, which is growing quickly and is part of the digital advertising sector, which The Guardian in a recent article suggested that actually puts out more emissions than does the global aviation industry. So this is really important work that we're doing. We're global, so as per the last conversation, we have a lot of questions that as our sort of framework and sustainability frameworks takes off, some questions that we're going to have to deliver. But we work with high-profile brands that are interested in putting their content into windows. So what we'll be talking today, this just helps sort of visualize how we're sort of lighting up high streets around the world and actually have now taken to the skies where we've launched a fleet of drones, which will come up here, that also are bringing up an array of different questions. So that just helps visualize what FrontRunner is up to and the work that we've been doing the last 5 years.
All right, so I consider Nathan just a natural innovator. He's a serial entrepreneur. But maybe you can unpack this a little bit more, Nathan. We had struck a deal, an accord here, it's about a year ago, whereby carbon fit into your plan and your outreach to your clients. So as opposed to me retelling it, why don't you share with the group what you've done around carbon?
Yeah, so as mentioned, FrontRunner from day one has been positioned as a sustainable business. Turning those window fronts that are sitting vacant, was one sort of opportunity that we explored and have been really focused on that. Number two is that we chose, over putting digital screens in our windows, we actually use projections. So we work with Panasonic and develop what's called the Firefly illumination system that you saw me pass by there, that sort of drastically decreases the energy that we're using to initiate sort of these installations. So as Carbon RX was gaining steam, Marty and I had a conversation. I said, listen, this is coming up more and more in the conversations with the brands that we're working with. What should we do? So FrontRunner purchased an array of carbon credits. And the conversation at the time was, could we retire these on behalf of the brands that we're working with? Or should this be in line with FrontRunner? So some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today is the pace of play, or how quickly it moves on the brand side. So for the course of the last year, we've sort of decided for FrontRunner to retire those sort of credits based on that interest. So look at me as a non-expert sort of in the sustainable space, but an active participant sort of in this space. And really, it's almost a year to the day that we've, initiated and finalized our agreement. So think of it as a bit of a report card, the good and the bad of the ugly, and sort of a progress report on what I'm experiencing every single day as we pitch these companies to take their media live across the world. Since we cut the agreement, 250 proposals have gone out. We have about a 20% close ratio, so you can understand that. And there's been 12 brands that have sort of gone down the path with us that were enabled to sort of speak to that sort of opportunity of retiring their credit as part of the conversation.
So I could go into that super deep. I get excited about this kind of reseller kind of structure, like an airline situation that I see you doing. But I'll come back to you, Joe, because I'm actually interested in the regional differences in the country and attitudes around this topic. And you're in the steel belt of Canada, and you've been spending a lot of time around City Hall and the chamber in that region. Just interested in the thoughts and attitudes, and maybe where those people are at in their carbon journey.
So that's a really good point. Is because we're centralized, and there's 14 million people around that corridor from Windsor up to Montreal. Being involved with some of the Chamber of Commerce, I just recently attended an AGM there in Stoney Creek, and a lot of the companies are lost. They don't know what to do. So they know this is part of their fabric. Once they claim they want to be net zero, they obviously have to come to fruition and exercise their activities, data, going into the data, scope 1, scope 2, 3. So what I find is they just need to use that Shakespearean expression. Like I believe our role is to be the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. They're going to lead their people accordingly, but I think we need to direct them that way because no one's an expert in anything, right? So I think what happens from my perspective is learning from yourself and Neil and getting an extension of where this needs to go for them. Because this is not going away. And like Allison mentioned, this is not a liberal, conservative, NDP situation. This is a global, the Paris Accord, this is all bigger than that. So and reporting their financials, especially with the Chamber of Commerce, that's something that they really have to concentrate on. The latest development is with the city of Hamilton. They claim to want to be net zero. It's on their website, so we had a really good positive interaction with them. And the main message is there is that they have a certain amount of credits that they have to abide by. And whether it's scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, we asked them to break it down accordingly. So our approach there is to basically go after and address the scope 1 to eventually go to scope 3. As you said, scope 3 is a little bit more complicated, but scope 1 they can determine immediately. So and discussions with the mayor there and their climate action team really brought everything to fruition. And by having these meetings, they really want to be a forerunner amongst communities. And everyone knows, well, by 2050, 70% of the world's population will be in these urban centers. And it's an extension of C40, which is sustainable cities across the world. So we need to really address some of these communities because there's a lot of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions that we can tackle immediately that can help us with, obviously, climate change. And the one point I remember distinctly from the mayor, she said there's major companies who are going to be doing work with California that are really afraid of this and don't know what to do. And I use lost, but in a kind way, right? So in essence, that really was an eye-opener for me and my mission to go forward with this.
And to build on that, that there is fear out there, from that perspective, greenwashing response, whatever, of those 250 plus proposals that have gone out, there isn't a single brand or agency that's buying on those brands that wasn't interested and love what we are doing. But what we're finding, as I mentioned, that pace of play, that when they want to proceed and use it as part of their awards package or work that into their own frameworks, it gets held up. And that is a big sort of takeaway that from perspective of working with these brands is, and you mentioned in your intro, is it's slow moving. So we have to think of the work that we're doing right now as kind of the Mars rover of exploration, setting methodologies, internally knowing what we know about our said business. But there is fear that's out there. And I think a big question for this conference is to take a look as how can we go about alleviating that fear to our clients?
So that's an interesting one. I've seen some personal validation of that, Nathan. So are you saying that the agency side, say the marketing team, this fits, this makes sense, we're up for it, but then it hits the CFO, CEO, or
hits legal.
It's legal.
It hits legal, from that sort of perspective where they need, because we want to promote this. Like our job as sort of public space pioneers in this space is to promote the work that we're doing. And when that becomes involved, it changes the dynamic considerably, sort of from that perspective. FrontRunner is interesting because we work with the age-old industry of landlords that are actually very advanced in this space as they have their races to net zero and things like that. On the media landscape, it's very new. Like during the course of the agreement that we cut was the first framework agreement in the digital out-of-home advertising sector that was cut 6 months ago. So the methodologies that we needed to sort of employ early on are starting to be sort of stratified a little bit. But the answer is excitement at the agency, buyer, brand level when you have those conversations. CFOs, neither here nor there, but when it goes into legal, days turn to weeks, turn to months, and we move in a matter of hours and days.
Yeah, great call out. There is one lawyer in the room. He's a good personal friend of mine, and so there are good lawyers out there.
Can you identify him so we know?
Wayne Burnacavage, the co-chair,
Okay.
Great lawyer. Yeah, and so maybe then just to build off of the geographical diversity, because I'm just always intrigued by thinking different. And so, Joseph, you kind of hinted on this. Businesses in Southern Ontario, they're going to be doing trade with California, and so they're trying to get their arms around this entire topic. Nathan, you're actively doing business in, say, New York, California. Do you see differences based on East-West Coast?
Yeah, so for a little bit of perspective, we're also in the film industry in Los Angeles, and we're sort of pioneering sort of a new approach to filmmaking that calls virtual production. It's a very sustainable way about building film, so that's where I really cut my teeth in this space of content creation, that's sort of understanding that California is far more advanced than up here in Canada on those decision making, and those media buyers move a little quicker because they've likely seen it in some capacity before. On the Canadian front, a little more sort of behind on that case. So I generally see it's complicated, right? We have our landlord stakeholders, we have the media buy groups, we have the brands all at the table, and I'm just trying to get revenue so that we can put these things sort of to the test. But I know that like we've sort of taken on this role as, you know, as I said, pioneers of putting it literally as the first page in our deck, just to see that it's not missed and buried, you know, that we will offset that campaign. And offset is a big question in its own right. We recognize, because there weren't frameworks agreement in our industry, that we had to be very simple and choose the path of least resistance. So we went to Panasonic and said, okay, what's our consumption here? We go to the landlords and understand what's our consumption, and we did sort of that internal math to come up with a figure of which we are using as that baseline. But if you look at the advertising sector in terms of these frameworks that are being created, which, as mentioned, is larger than the aviation sector, everything from a single email, you know, that's 1.5 of a gram of an emission that leads up, it's significant to track that. And so whose math is right? And these are the questions that legal is asking, because when it goes into a press release, I'm not sure if you guys were, you know, super excited or horrified by the last presentation in terms of just the key questions that are going to be asking and exposure.
Yeah, actually, I had the conversation at the break around that with a couple people. It is a bit terrifying what Allison shared with us around accountabilities and how this is cemented in. So maybe the new antibody and the climate movement is a little bit of the legal liability that comes with the whole thing.
For sure, and it's conferences just like this to raise those questions, which can't be done in public debate, you know, or so, or in a newspaper, that, you know, we ask those questions to, you know, help guide policy making.
Now, Joe, you spent a part of your working career living in Europe, and you're even an Italian citizen, I think,
Yes,
officially. So,
Yeah.
curious.
Myself and Pat are the only two Italians here.
Validated. Italians know each other. They're all related somehow and connected. They can identify across the room.
That's right.
It's uncanny. Curious on your perspective then at looking at Europe. You had shared a stat about, you know, how much forward the Europeans are on this one, but are there other nuances or trends that you're seeing out of there that we should be thinking about coming to Canada?
Well, the one thing I really pointed out is the fossil fuel industry. There's right now the EU just has a new housing and energy minister, and he's Danish. So I spent a lot of time in Denmark, and they're creating a ban, basically going away from fossil fuels as much as possible. So I shared this with you, Marty, before. So Europe now is past the 50 percentile of renewable energy. Now they are relying 50% of their energy on just renewable resources, which is massive. We're, I think, at 25, maybe even lower than that. So we're still heavily involved with the fossil fuel industry. And I see that trend coming this way eventually, but I think we still have to put the offsets in place to negate what we're doing here. And eventually transition like the Europeans are doing. So oil and gas is not going away, especially in Canada and the United States. So there's not a fear thing, but we have to understand that we have to use the funds and the profits to help our brothers and sisters in Alberta, for example, to transition to renewable. And I find when you're looking at the European standard, they have a different mindset, because they're looking at generations down the road. A lot of them, particularly in Denmark, they're rebuilding buildings. They're not going into new construction because that's obviously more sustainable. There's that concrete carbon footprint that they're getting away. But it's mindsets like that they're preparing for the future. They're looking 100 years down the road. I think maybe some of our perspective is very short-sighted. Maybe it's that complement, the problem is, you know, when you're looking at the U.S., and this is just my opinion, that, you know, it's shareholders driven, whereas compared to stakeholders, right? So I think from the European perspective, it's more of, you know, the community, the EU community, and how it's going to benefit long term. And I know that, you know, when we're looking at oil and gas, they still have, obviously, Norway's supplies the UK, et cetera, and they have the problem in the Russia, and they try to get away from the Russian oil. But they really are forefront, but they had no choice, right? So, you know, we have oil and gas here in our backyard. So it's just a different mindset when it comes to that, so.
Yeah, I would agree as far as mindset and geography, the impact of geography on it. Nathan, curious, we've had conversations on and off over the last year on the source of the credits, where they're from, either geographically or source. I wonder if you could speak to that in any conversations you've had with buyers, and any brand specific you can mention that had a preference.
Yeah, like brands are interested in like hyper localism. Is there the opportunity through the carbon credit eventually to come back to the farmer or the indigenous group on the traditional territory of which we're making money from? So that's a big conversation that comes up. And really, as you're building out network and others, that's something that will come in time. So I can't really sort of answer that. Yeah. But ad buying is hyper local, so that's one that I sort of have to skirt around. This is a very honest commentary of what's happening, but to give that type of sort of answer. So the hyper local nature of money being generated by FrontRunner, wanting to see that return go to local is interesting, and I want to see how that sort of develops out. I think that would be a key takeaway to me from that perspective.
Yeah, and my experience has been conversation with Canadian companies, understand the importance of reconciliation, understand the importance of local. I've since learned that local in Canada, we validated this in the food system bit, but local, if it's not my town or my province, it still can be my country, and that's still considered by definition local to lots of people. I do find crossing the border in the US, talking about First Nations and the importance of the social license and social attributes of First Nations reconciliation, it lands a lot flatter there. I think there's a dilution of social interest in the U.S. From all kinds of other.
There's an interesting case study that we're in the midst of starting literally today when I fly to California. I have a series of meeting with indigenous groups, casino owners in California and Miami that's coming up here that own the Hard Rock Hotel, amongst sort of others. We've actually just launched, it hasn't been announced, called FIT, FrontRunner Indigenous Technologies. It's 2/3 indigenous owned. Created as a special purpose vehicle to house a Disney buy of a significant amount of money. So I'm interested to see, are we able to get that sort of big uptake from a group like Disney if it's First Nation initiated? So again, that will be sort of wait, and come Christmas, I'll be able to see how that works. So is it a question of who these conversations are coming from? Me, the question, and whether, if it's being Indigenous led, as which FIT is, if we're going to get more sort of play or quicker response.
Yeah, that's a good call out. In terms of trends, Joseph, maybe to put you on the spot, do you see anything that's shifted maybe since the time you started doing your homework in this space to maybe where you're at today? You're drinking from the fire hose, kind of learning the carbon market.
Yeah, I am.
At the same time, like I think many of us are, and so wondered if you're seeing a trend or a shift.
I think I go back to the example of the municipality, and they know that this is something that they really need to exercise and go forward for the future, and putting in that Indigenous component, I think really makes a difference, and that's, just speaking to the mayor, and she mentioned that's one part that really interests her per se. So that's one piece, and the other piece I could lead with is, for example, when Honeywell, we used to deal a lot with Trane Technologies. That's all the HVAC equipment, and they're starting to exercise. It's called the 1 gigaton challenge. By 2030, they're going to reduce their emissions by 1 billion tons. So you see a lot of these companies, and you have to realize that HVAC contributes 15% of the global GHGs in the world, plus another 5% is from refrigeration. So Trane Technologies obviously has HVAC and refrigeration. So any public building, hospital, institution, higher learning, has that 20% that is contributing to greenhouse gases. And I find that a lot of those companies are going to net zero. There's a book I read, it's called Net Positive by Paul Pullman. He used to be the CEO of Unilever, and he was one of the leaders in pushing that company forward globally. But more importantly, going back to the Trane example, is that if we're reducing 20% of the greenhouse gases within all the cities, that's a significant dent on the greenhouse gases and getting to net zero. I spoke about the Europeans, they're looking at net zero 2050, but a lot of them dialed it back to net 2040. Some are looking at 2030 to go back to how aggressive they are. Maybe we don't have that technologies and the mindset to go to that far, but if we're looking at 2050, maybe it's 2040, and that's what I could leave you with.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think there's a foundational nuance between the European response to say we're going to be net zero and hit the target. Because what I feel coming out of the US probably being the furthest extreme is we're going to decarbonize our industry. And I think it's an interesting approach to the challenge. So we're going to use technology to get our way there. We're not going to make a statement to be zero as much as we'll work towards a goal. And it's just a nuance and a trend in how a market's responding. So as you can imagine, the American economy is all in growth, and you can't necessarily grow and reduce carbon emissions. There's a natural tension in that thing. We have about 5 minutes left. I'd love to pull any questions out of the crowd if somebody had something specific for our panelists. Yeah, there's a question back here. And I certainly welcome everyone to introduce themselves on their question. Carson, just to the back.
Thanks, guys, for all the information. You guys did mention creating carbon in the Indigenous communities. I do have 2 questions. How long does it take to complete a carbon project in their communities, and how much does it cost the nation to get involved?
It's probably a little bit more directed my way. I think if you plan for, as I mentioned in the opening, 24 months minimum, but I think if you said 36 is kind of from start to finish. And then most carbon companies, I mean, our model is we front end the expenses. So the nation, the intent is there's no expense on behalf of the nation. Where there is opportunity for the nation, if I look at Treaty 4 or Treaty 6, where we're running ranch cattle, is to fence and do dugouts and do some infrastructure build. That creates a really strong carbon. There's investment there. And depending on the nation, they either front that or we try to run it through the actual carbon revenues. But that would be the short answer to your question. Thanks.
Good question.
Any other questions around sort of this carbon economy buyer side of things? I certainly welcome, Nathan, your thought on maybe a trend. If you're really good at seeing out in the future, maybe if you and I were talking about the Biden administration and some comments they made on Friday and so on. Just wondering if you were to offer this group some insight into the future.
Well, it's election season when you're tackling the big topics sort of head on, and I think it was just this last Friday where, the U.S. framework agreement was sort of put into place for consideration. So to me, that's sort of the overall sort of 10,000-foot place of which our U.S. business will be operating, hypothetically. Today is a bit of a microcosm, as I mentioned, of sort of the industry in its own. Literally, as I was sitting there, we just closed an agreement with Schneider Electric, the multinational, and they're putting a clock in front of the Royal York Hotel in Toronto and a 5-year countdown to Paris, as an example. So here's an example where they've recognized the benefit of out-of-home, which obviously is consuming energy, but to put that front and center. And what's interesting about FrontRunner, it's called sort of one-to-many. It's a single board, but we'll get 5 to 10 million impressions a month, so that impact for that energy sort of output is quite significant. Average numbers on a billboard some will say it's as high as 20 households in a year for a single advertising campaign. So that's what's guiding some of my sort of decision making. And I forwarded you case examples that are coming to FrontRunner, where brands are now reaching to us and thinking of us as the sustainable out-of-home business. Espresso was an example that they're looking to repurpose their coffee makers. They thought that our window fronts would be significant. Schneider Electric example, Disney in these upcoming meetings. So I think sort of the trends are groups are reaching out, brands are reaching out, there's expectations, but they don't know what to expect. So our job is to have conversations like this to be educators in the field.
Yeah, that's a great point.
The guide and the side, not the sage on the stage.
Yeah, your quote's coming up on Shakespearean. Yes. Maybe the last one then, and certainly any more questions, but the last one, I love the one about advice. So what advice, and maybe Joseph, you want to go first?
I just think that we just keep going. If you're lagging behind, you're already behind. And just keep going forward, keep educating each other, and we're all going to learn from each other, right? So in the essence, what's going to happen is, we live under one petri dish, and it's all for the planet. It's for the next generations, and I know there's 7 generational. That's the mindset, and that's very important because, from my standpoint, I have a nephew and 3 nieces. This is what I'm doing this for. That's my Simon Sinek why. Like my why is I want to leave a better planet. I hunt and fish back in Ontario and love nature and That's important to me. And this is part of the reason why I'm here. So I think this is very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you. Nathan, advice?
It's a shots on goal approach, right? The more shots you can sort of put out there. In my case, it's with brands and real estate groups. In your cases and entrepreneurs here, it might be, sort of much different. So it's a numbers game at this point. Understanding, and defining what outcomes will be. It's not perhaps necessary that it's a brand buying into your carbon credit strategy. It's more education at this point, and that's to your sort of intro. It's a long game, and so defining what that is. And the more I'm recognizing, you spoke to, your work with the Indigenous communities. It's a 24+ month approach. I'm sort of seeing the other on our side that looks like that. So while we're moving very quickly in the industry, I think we just have to widen our lens and don't get discouraged based on that.
Thanks, Nathan. All right, Pat, how are we for time? All right. Please join me in thanking our panelists here for their thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.